Hey guys, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're diving into a story that's not just political, but deeply human. A story full of shifting alliances, silent betrayals, and quiet fires that turned into roaring conflict. A story where two nations, once unlikely friends, became sworn enemies. So before we begin, don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoy uncovering the untold sides of history. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapter. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? I love reading those. It reminds me that we're all connected, across time, across borders, across stories. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, pull the blanket close, because tonight we're traveling to the heart of the Middle East, a place where ancient empires meet modern ideologies, where religion, oil, revolution, and survival all crash together to shape a conflict that's still burning today. This is the beginning of the long, complicated history between Israel and Iran, and it starts not with hatred, but with friendship. Before they were enemies, they were allies. Before fire, there was silence. Before rhetoric, there was strategy. And even before that, centuries ago, there was memory. In the 6th century BCE, the Persian king Cyrus the Great did something few rulers in history had done before. He allowed the Jewish exiles taken by Babylon to return to their homeland, to Jerusalem, to rebuild, to start again. This act is remembered with deep reverence in Jewish tradition. Cyrus, a non-Jewish ruler, is honored as a deliverer. His name is etched into sacred texts, spoken with respect across generations, and so began a relationship that would stretch across thousands of years, sometimes quiet, sometimes tense, sometimes deeply intertwined. Jewish life in Persia flourished for centuries. It endured invasions, conversions, dynasties. It learned to adapt, to survive, to weave itself into the Persian fabric while never forgetting its roots. But to understand the modern conflict between Israel and Iran, we need to fast forward to the 20th century, to the age of empires falling and new states rising. After World War II, two nations began to shape their identities in a rapidly changing world. Israel, born from trauma, forged in the ashes of the Holocaust, surrounded by hostile neighbors. A tiny state isolated, fragile, determined to survive. Iran, ruled by the Shah, a monarch supported by the West, modernizing rapidly, trying to straddle tradition and ambition. And between them, a quiet, strategic partnership. Because though Israel was encircled by enemies, Iran was different. It wasn't Arab. It wasn't part of the pan-Arab nationalism that called for Israel's destruction. It had its own identity and its own goals. The Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, saw in Israel something useful, a military and technological partner, a gateway to Western influence, a fellow outcast in a hostile region. The alliance was never loud. It was careful. It was in the shadows, but it was real. Israeli intelligence worked with Iranian secret police. Israeli engineers helped develop Iranian agriculture. Iranian oil flowed into Israeli ports. Israeli weapons and training flowed back. It was a pragmatic friendship, not built on love, but on fear and need and ambition. Israel, in turn, embraced the periphery doctrine. It couldn't rely on Arab neighbors, so it looked to the outer ring. Non-Arab Muslim states like Iran, Turkey, and Ethiopia became key partners. For a while, it worked. Israeli officials moved quietly through Tehran. Tourism grew. Even the Israeli flag could sometimes be seen, discreetly but defiantly. But beneath this cooperation, something else was building. The Shah's regime was modern, secular, and westernized, but also authoritarian, deeply unequal, and increasingly detached from Iran's religious majority. While cities glittered with wealth, rural Iran seethed with resentment. While the Shah flew to Europe for state dinners, clerics whispered sermons in hidden mosques. Old wounds stirred, old powers awakened, and among the voices rising in protest, one was louder than the rest. Ruhollah Khomeini. From exile, he watched the Shah's court with fury. He saw Israel not as an ally of Iran, but as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. In Khomeini's eyes, Israel was the ultimate outsider, a Western implant in Islamic land, a secular, arrogant force propped up by America and oil. And when the revolution finally came, it came like a flood. In 1979, the Shah fell. The monarchy crumbled, and Khomeini returned. The Islamic Republic of Iran was born, not from votes or diplomacy, but from rage and fire and theological certainty. And with that, Israel was cast out. The Israeli embassy in Tehran was shuttered. Its doors were handed to the PLO. The Israeli flag was burned. Chants of death to Israel echoed through the streets, and a partnership that had once quietly helped define Middle Eastern strategy was now erased, rewritten, demonized. The new Iran was not interested in compromise. It saw Israel as illegitimate, a crime, a threat to Islam. It wasn't just political, it was theological, it was absolute. But history doesn't die that easily. Even as the embassies closed and the rhetoric exploded, the old connections never fully disappeared, and what began as silence would soon evolve into proxy wars, into nuclear fears, into drone strikes, cyber attacks, and regional chaos. But here, in this moment, in the ashes of revolution, the conflict was reborn, and neither side would ever see the other the same way again. The revolution was over, but the fire had just begun. In the streets of Tehran, murals of Khomeini stared down like prophets. In the air, slogans replaced laws. And in the back rooms of power, Iran's foreign policy was rewritten in ink, blood, and scripture. Israel, once a quiet ally, had become a symbol not just of the West, but of everything the Islamic Republic vowed to resist. And yet, history is never so clean, because while the public screamed, "Death to Israel," private needs whispered a different language. In 1980, just 1 year after Iran's revolution, Iraq invaded. Saddam Hussein, calculating, brutal, and opportunistic, saw the chaos in Iran as an opening. He believed Iran was weak, divided, exposed. He was wrong. The Iran-Iraq War would last 8 years. It would kill over 1 million people. It would devastate cities, poison fields, and bleed both nations dry. And it would create one of the strangest, darkest chapters in the Israel-Iran story. Because as Iraq rained missiles on Tehran, as chemical weapons scorched Iranian soldiers, as the West silently backed Saddam, Israel began helping Iran. Yes, the same Iran that had just called for Israel's destruction, the same regime that had purged Jews, executed opponents, and denounced Zionism as a disease. Why? Because geopolitics is rarely about morality. It is about survival. And Israel, facing threats from Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, saw a longer game. From Israel's point of view, a strong Iraq was far more dangerous than a chaotic Iran. Saddam was building a nuclear reactor. He had invaded a neighbor without hesitation, and he was uniting the Arab world with dreams of pan-Arab leadership. Iran, meanwhile, was isolated, shunned by the West, bled by war, suspicious of everyone. So Israeli strategists made a brutal calculation: better Iran than Iraq. And so began the covert supply chain. Through shadow networks, weapons were transferred, parts, spare equipment, ammunition, things Iran needed desperately, things Israel had and was willing to sell. The operations were hidden, routed through third countries. Code names were used. Diplomats denied everything, but the truth, like smoke, always finds a way through cracks. Later, it would be called the Iran-Contra affair, a scandal involving the United States, Israel, and a network of illegal arms deals. The U.S. secretly sold weapons to Iran, despite an embargo, and funneled the proceeds to anti-communist rebels in Latin America. Israel was the middleman, and for a time it worked. Iran got weapons. Israel weakened Iraq. The U.S. kept its hands clean, but nothing in the Middle East stays hidden forever. When the deals were exposed, outrage followed, not just in America, but inside Iran. Many in Iran's new elite were shocked. Some truly believed the Islamic Republic had cut all ties with Zionists. They saw themselves as defenders of Islamic purity, uncorrupted, uncompromising. To learn that their own government had dealt with Israel, even secretly, was a blow to their faith. Literally, it deepened internal paranoia. It radicalized rhetoric. It hardened the belief that Israel was not just a state, but a manipulator behind global curtains. From this moment on, Iran's stance toward Israel became more than political. It was apocalyptic. It was theological. And in the shadows, a new strategy emerged. Iran could not destroy Israel directly. It lacked the weapons, the reach, the power. But it could do something else. It could bleed Israel, slowly, silently, not with armies, but with proxies. This idea, the proxy war, would define the next 4 decades. It began in Lebanon. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to fight the PLO. But in the vacuum left by war, something new rose. A group of Shiite fighters, trained by Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, emerged in the south. They called themselves Hezbollah, the Party of God. Funded, trained, and guided by Iran, Hezbollah would become Iran's sword in the Levant. For Israel, this was a nightmare. A highly motivated, religiously fueled militia, right on its border, loyal not to Beirut or Damascus, but to Tehran. Missiles, ambushes, kidnappings. Over the years, Hezbollah would attack Israeli soldiers, civilians, embassies. It would kill hundreds. It would help shape the narrative of Israel as under siege and justify Iran's growing influence in Arab politics. But Lebanon was only the beginning. Iran began exporting its revolution across the region, not by conquering, but by embedding. Shiite movements in Iraq, Bahrain, Yemen all became part of a wider arc of influence, and through them, Iran encircled Israel, not directly, but ideologically, strategically, incrementally. Israel watched this with growing concern, and its response, not to launch full-scale war, but to counter in kind. The Mossad intensified operations, assassinations, sabotage, cyber attacks. Each side denied involvement. Each side blamed third parties. But beneath the denials was a simple truth. Israel and Iran were now locked in a Cold War. One without declarations, one without borders, but no less deadly. And in this war, no battlefield was off limits. Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, even cyberspace. The fire that began in 1979 was spreading, not in explosions, but in strategies. And while leaders gave speeches, ordinary people in Tel Aviv, in Tehran, in Beirut, were the ones who paid the price. Because when nations go to war in the shadows, the light that's lost is often human. It didn't begin with a weapon. It began with a dream of energy, of independence, of power, the kind that lights cities, but also silences enemies. Iran's nuclear ambitions go back to before the revolution, to the days of the Shah when nuclear power was seen as modern, civilized, Western. Back then, the United States helped. Under the Atoms for Peace program, Iran received its first research reactor in the 1960s. American engineers helped build facilities. U.S. universities trained Iranian physicists. The Shah spoke of building dozens of nuclear plants. There were even whispers, quiet, cautious, about a future bomb, just in case. But when the revolution came, everything changed, or so it seemed. The new Islamic Republic denounced the West. It called the nuclear program corrupt, decadent. For a time the project went cold, but not for long, because Iran, now isolated, surrounded, mistrusted, began to see nuclear power differently, not just as energy, but as leverage, not just as science, but as security. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Iran quietly resumed its nuclear efforts. They built new facilities. They sought help from Pakistan, Russia, China. They spoke of peaceful research, medical isotopes, electricity, but suspicions grew, and no one watched more closely than Israel. For Israel, this wasn't just about physics, it was about survival. A nuclear Iran wasn't just a rival, it was a threat to the very existence of the Jewish state. This wasn't theory, this was lived memory. The Holocaust, the wars of 1948, 1967, 1973, the constant rhetoric from Tehran that Israel was a cancer, that it should be wiped from the map. For Israeli leaders, the idea of Iran holding a nuclear bomb was unacceptable, unimaginable, unthinkable, and so they acted, not with speeches, but with silence. In 2003, Iran's secret nuclear sites were exposed. The world gasped. Iran denied everything. Israel said little, but prepared much. And then came the war no one saw. It began with scientists. One by one, leading Iranian nuclear experts were assassinated in the streets, in their cars, in broad daylight. No one claimed responsibility, but the methods were precise, the motives clear. Iran blamed Mossad. Israel said nothing. And then came something stranger, something new. In 2010, a mysterious computer virus swept through Iran's nuclear facilities. It was called Stuxnet. It didn't steal data. It didn't crash systems. It did something far more elegant and more dangerous. It caused Iran's centrifuges, delicate machines used to enrich uranium, to malfunction, to spin too fast, to shatter. Thousands of them were destroyed, and no one fired a single shot. This was a new kind of war, a war of code, of silence. Stuxnet was the world's first known cyber weapon. It was sophisticated, targeted, and terrifying. Experts later concluded it had likely been created by Israel and the United States, working together quietly in digital shadows. For Israel, it was a triumph of innovation, a bloodless blow, a delay in Iran's march toward the bomb. But for Iran, it was humiliation and revelation. They now understood this war wasn't just fought on battlefields or borders. It was fought in hard drives, in servers, in silence. Iran responded, not with missiles, but with hackers. Banks in Israel were hit. Power grids flickered. Government websites crashed. The cyber war had begun, and it hasn't stopped since. But behind the code, the physics continued. Iran rebuilt. They buried their facilities underground. They hardened them against attacks. They expanded their program, slowly, steadily, defiantly. International inspectors came and went. Agreements were signed, then broken, then signed again. In 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, was reached. The world breathed a little easier. Iran agreed to limit its enrichment, to reduce stockpiles, to allow inspections. In return, sanctions were eased. Trade reopened. Hope stirred. But Israel was not convinced. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the deal a historic mistake. He compared it to feeding a tiger while hoping it wouldn't bite. He even spoke before the U.S. Congress, bypassing the American president, to warn of what he saw as betrayal. Because for Israel, any deal that left Iran with nuclear infrastructure was a risk too far. And when the U.S. withdrew from the deal in 2018, tensions spiked again. Iran resumed enrichment. Israel resumed attacks. Missiles were launched. Ships were sabotaged. Facilities exploded under mysterious circumstances. Each strike was followed by denial. Each denial was met with more escalation, and the world watched, anxious, helpless, waiting. Because now this wasn't just a regional rivalry, it was a global crisis. Other nations entered the game: Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, each with their own fears, each with their own goals. But the heart of the storm remained the same: Israel and Iran, locked in a cycle of suspicion, strategy, and survival. And as the technology advanced, so did the stakes. Because a nuclear weapon isn't just a bomb, it's a symbol, a deterrent, a final card in a very dangerous game. And in this game, miscalculation is just as deadly as intent. By the end of the 2000s, the map of the Middle East looked the same, but beneath its borders, everything had shifted. The names of countries hadn't changed, but the forces that shaped them had. And at the center of this invisible redraw were two powers locked in shadow: Iran and Israel. Iran didn't need armies to expand. It used something stronger: collapse. In Iraq, the fall of Saddam Hussein had left a power vacuum. The United States had overthrown a dictator, but in doing so, it had dismantled the state that contained sectarian fury. Into that chaos, Iran stepped, not loudly, not officially, but patiently. Iranian-trained militias formed. Shiite leaders, once exiled, returned. The new Iraqi political elite became intertwined spiritually, financially, and strategically with Tehran. From the ruins of American war, Iran had gained its first bridge westward. Then came Syria. For decades, Syria and Iran had been allies, bound by mutual hatred of Israel and opposition to U.S. presence in the region. But when Syria plunged into civil war in 2011, the stakes changed. The regime of Bashar al-Assad, brutal, cornered, but useful, became Iran's project. Iran sent weapons, then advisors, then soldiers, then militias, thousands of them, from Iraq, from Lebanon, from Afghanistan. They came not just to save Assad, but to build a corridor, a physical land route of influence stretching from Tehran to Beirut. This was not just strategy, it was geography, a vision of dominance across the northern Middle East. And at the western end of that corridor was Israel. The Israeli military watched this development with growing unease. What began as a civil war was becoming something else, a front, a base, a launching point. Iranian drones began flying over Syrian skies. Missile shipments moved toward Lebanon. Revolutionary Guard outposts appeared dangerously close to the Golan Heights. Israel could no longer afford silence, and so it began striking. At first, just weapons convoys, then warehouses, then command centers. Each attack was precise, surgical, mostly unclaimed, but the message was clear. Israel would not allow Iran to entrench itself in Syria. The air war became routine, strikes in Damascus, Homs, Aleppo, sometimes weekly. Russian air defenses watched. Sometimes they warned. Mostly they stood back. Because even as Russia supported Assad, it had no desire to see a full-scale Iran-Israel war. Too unpredictable, too dangerous. But the danger was real. Each airstrike risked retaliation. Each missile that crossed a border could spark a wider fire, and still the strikes continued. Because for Israel, inaction was a greater threat. Iran's goal, they believed, was not just to contain Israel. It was to surround it, to turn every neighbor into a pressure point. Gaza, with Hamas, often armed by Iran. Lebanon, with Hezbollah, now stockpiled with over 100,000 rockets. Syria, with outposts, drones, missile factories. Even the Red Sea, where Houthi rebels in Yemen, backed by Iran, occasionally targeted Israeli-linked shipping. It was a strategy of many fronts, of slow strangulation. But Iran didn't see it that way. From Tehran's perspective, these were defensive measures, a shield against Israeli aggression, a network of deterrence. To them, Israel was the regional aggressor, occupying, bombing, assassinating with impunity. And to their allies from Hezbollah to the Houthis, Iran was not a puppet master, but a protector. The truth, of course, lay somewhere in the smoke. Meanwhile, diplomacy tried to catch up. Talks over Iran's nuclear program sputtered. The U.S. had left the deal in 2018. Europe tried to keep it alive, but trust was gone. Iran enriched more uranium. Israel issued more warnings. The language grew darker, the lines thinner. And then came 2020. The world was focused on a pandemic, but in the shadows, the war continued. In January, the U.S., reportedly with Israeli intelligence, killed Qasem Soleimani. He was Iran's top general, the architect of its foreign policy, and perhaps the most powerful man in the region after the supreme leader. His convoy was struck by a drone near Baghdad airport. His death was a shock to Iran's system, a red line crossed. Iran responded with missile attacks on U.S. bases. No Americans died, but the message was sent. In November, another figure fell, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. The father of Iran's nuclear program was ambushed and killed near Tehran. Once again, Iran blamed Israel. Once again, Israel said nothing. But behind the silence was strategy. For Israel, assassinations were not just revenge. They were preemptive war, delays, warnings. And for Iran, each death was a justification, a reason to dig deeper, to push harder, to prepare for the day when words would no longer suffice. Meanwhile, the region watched. Saudi Arabia, Iran's Sunni rival, began inching closer to Israel. Not openly, not diplomatically, but strategically. They shared a fear that Iran, unchecked, would reshape the region, and so the map shifted again. Old enemies became quiet allies. New alliances formed in whispers, lines blurred, and at the center of it all, two nations remained fixed, one Jewish, one Islamic, both ancient, both wounded, both certain of their righteousness, locked not just in a conflict over borders, but in a vision of the future itself. Because this was no longer about missiles, or uranium, or theology. It was about survival and the terrifying knowledge that in trying to survive, both nations might bring the region to the edge. It's easy to think of war as something distant, as missiles, maps, headlines. But behind the maps, there are homes. Behind the headlines, lives. And in this conflict, some of those lives have never known peace. In Tehran, a teenager scrolls through her phone. She's grown up under sanctions. Her world is shaped by slogans, by scarcity, by suspicion. She has never seen Israel, never met a Jew, but from textbooks to television she's told it is the enemy. In Tel Aviv, a young man checks his alerts. His phone buzzes. A rocket has been fired from Gaza. He runs to a shelter. Again. He too has never seen Iran. But he's heard the chants. He's seen the missiles in Syria. He knows the name of Hezbollah's leader better than some of his neighbors. This is the human cost of an invisible war. Two nations of people who don't know each other, but fear each other deeply. And that fear is not an accident. It's built. In Iran, children are taught that Israel is illegitimate, a foreign implant in Islamic land. They grow up with murals of burning flags with "Death to Israel" painted on walls. In Israel, generations are raised with stories of existential threat, of Holocaust, of war, of survival against odds. They learn early that Iran is not just another country, but perhaps the most dangerous enemy of all. The media on both sides feeds this. On Iranian state television, Israel is always portrayed as cruel, corrupt, desperate. On Israeli news, Iran is shown as a growing shadow, the center of radicalism, the hand behind every rocket. And so the people live in echo chambers, where every action confirms their fear, where nuance is drowned in noise. But something has changed, because war is no longer just fought in deserts or skies. It's fought on screens. This conflict now lives in cyberspace, in memes, videos, hashtags. Iranian influencers share anti-Israel content. Israeli accounts post surveillance footage of Iranian weapons convoys. Propaganda is retweeted. AI-generated fakes go viral. Deepfakes, altered maps, false flags, all swirl into a digital storm. In 2000, Telegram groups organized hacks. Anonymous style cells leaked documents. Iran-backed hackers hit Israeli water systems. Israeli cyber units retaliated. Suddenly, war wasn't something you watched. It was something you scrolled through. And in that scrolling, the line between truth and fiction blurred. Because now, the most powerful weapon isn't a missile, it's attention. If you can make someone feel afraid, you've already won a battle. And both sides have learned this. Iran has invested in cyber warfare, troll farms, media manipulation. Israel has built world-class cyber units, Unit 8200, known for stopping terror attacks before they happen. But this shift has a cost, because when everything becomes a weapon, truth suffers. When propaganda is constant, real pain is ignored, and the people, the real people, fade into caricatures. But still, they live. In Haifa, a grandmother remembers the bomb shelters of her youth and wonders if her grandchildren will know peace. In Isfahan, a father stares at rising prices, blocked websites, and thinks, this isn't just about Israel, it's about hope, about the future they keep promising, but never delivering. And through it all, both sides whisper the same questions. Why are we still here? Who profits from this fear? What if we were allowed to know each other? Because beneath the threats, the warheads, the headlines, there is something more powerful: curiosity, compassion, the possibility of understanding. But it remains only that, a possibility. Because every time it tries to emerge, something happens. A strike, a speech, a funeral, and the cycle begins again. Because this conflict is no longer just history, it is a system, a machine, and that machine runs on fear. This war does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a child's face, a shattered street, a burning flag. It does not always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, through advisors, through charities, through drone footage, shared without a logo. This is how it spreads, not through full-scale invasions, but through proxy. Iran doesn't need to plant its flag in foreign soil. It only needs to plant ideas and alliances. In Lebanon, that seed became a forest. Hezbollah, the Party of God, began in the 1980s as a resistance to Israeli occupation. But over the decades, it became more: a political party, a military power, a state within a state. Armed, trained, and funded by Iran, Hezbollah turned southern Lebanon into a launch pad, not only for rockets, but for ideology. It offered schools, clinics, martyrs' pensions. It became both sword and shield, attacking Israel, defending Shiite interests, claiming the moral high ground against Zionist oppression. But behind the resistance narrative was strategy, a permanent pressure point on Israel's northern border. Hezbollah's arsenal now exceeds 150,000 rockets, some capable of striking every inch of Israeli territory. And they're not just stored in bunkers. They're buried under homes, next to schools, inside cities. This is the nature of modern proxy war, where the battlefield is the neighborhood, where defense becomes indistinguishable from danger. In Yemen, it's the Houthis, a rebel group turned militia, turned state force. Backed by Iran, they fight Saudi Arabia, Israel's new silent partner. They chant the same slogans: death to America, death to Israel. In Iraq, militias loyal to Iran hold sway in parliament and sometimes launch missiles at U.S. or Israeli-linked bases. In Syria, Iranian forces continue to dig in, disguised, embedded, resilient. And every time Israel responds with a strike, a cyber attack, a covert operation, the web tightens. Because war is no longer linear. It's a network, and each thread pulled shakes the whole. Israel has responded with its own shadow network. It arms Kurdish forces, shares intelligence with Gulf states, launches strikes as far as Sudan, if needed, sometimes with planes, sometimes with sabotage, sometimes with silence. Each side claims defense. Each action builds the case for the next, and caught in the middle, millions of people with no interest in geopolitics, but every stake in survival. A father in Beirut, trying to shield his children from both airstrikes and recruitment. A woman in Sana'a, walking past murals of martyrs and wondering if her market will be hit next. An Israeli family in the Galilee hearing sirens and wondering, is this the war that won't stop? But the war does not stop because it works. Proxy war is cheaper, cleaner, at least on the surface. It avoids direct confrontation between giants. It lets them bleed each other slowly through others. But it also erodes something deeper, moral clarity. When militias bomb airports from civilian zones, when airstrikes level apartment blocks to hit one suspected operative, when children are both weapons and shields, who holds the blame? When charity clinics double as recruitment centers, when wedding convoys are tracked by drones, when funerals are watched from satellites, what law governs this war? International rules were written for states, for armies, for tanks crossing borders. But this is a war of whispers, of backdoor funding, of deniable killings, of we cannot confirm nor deny. And in that fog, justice dissolves. What remains is survival. And survival, for both Israel and Iran, has come to mean this: projecting force far from home. For Israel, it's about keeping threats far from its borders. For Iran, it's about preventing isolation by surrounding Israel with fire. But there's a price. Every drone strike, every explosion, every proxy death draws new blood into the cycle, recruits more, hardens more, fuels more fire, and the people who might once have questioned the war become part of it, because once your town is bombed, once your brother is killed, once your mosque or synagogue is struck, doubt fades, rage remains. And that rage becomes the next proxy, the next story, the next weapon, because in this war, stories matter. Iran tells a story of resistance, of standing up to Western-backed aggression, of defending Islam's dignity. Israel tells a story of survival, of defending itself from annihilation, of never again trusting the world to protect it. Both stories are built on real wounds. Both are powerful. Both are dangerous, because stories outlast battles. And in a region soaked in history, a story can be stronger than steel. So this war continues, in alleys, in mosques, in briefing rooms, in tweets, in silence, each side waiting, not for victory, but for the other to blink. And while they wait, the region burns quietly. Sometimes the battlefield moves to marble halls, to polished tables, to quiet rooms in Vienna, where tea is served, but no one drinks. Here, war wears a suit. It speaks in clauses. It negotiates. But it does not forget. This is diplomacy, and for decades the world has tried to tame the fire between Israel and Iran with paper. It began with fear that Iran was moving too close to the bomb, that Israel might act before the world was ready. So the world acted first. In 2015, after years of secret talks and public threats, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, was born. A deal. Iran would limit its nuclear program, reduce centrifuges, accept inspections. In exchange, sanctions would be lifted. Hope flickered. The West saw moderation. Iran saw relief. Israel saw danger. For Benjamin Netanyahu, the deal was not peace, but a pause, a trap. He called it a historic mistake. He spoke before the U.S. Congress without the president's approval, warning the world not to be fooled. Because from Israel's perspective, the deal delayed but didn't deny Iran's path to the bomb. And when Donald Trump tore up the JCPOA in 2018, Israel applauded, Iran fumed, and the cycle began again. Sanctions returned, hardliners rose, nuclear activity resumed, and the world, caught between war and diplomacy, wavered, because sanctions, too, are a form of war. They don't explode, but they suffocate. They shrink economies. They raise prices. They silence reformers and empower those who thrive on defiance. In Iran, the real collapsed. Medicine grew scarce. The middle class shrank. But the nuclear program did not stop, because for Iran, the program is more than uranium. It is leverage. It is pride. It is protection. And for Israel, its existence is a red line. So the diplomacy continued. Back-channel talks in Oman, European envoys, meetings in Geneva. Each time a glimmer of compromise. Each time sabotaged by politics, by assassinations, by mistrust. Because trust is hard to build in the shadow of spies. When Iranian scientists are killed in the street, when Israeli embassies are targeted abroad, when cyber attacks hit nuclear facilities, when secret documents are smuggled and revealed on live TV, the table may be set, but no one comes unarmed, and the world has taken sides. America, Israel's closest ally, supplies billions in aid and weapons. But even Washington is tired of war, tired of the Middle East, tired of choosing. Europe tries to mediate, but struggles to speak with one voice. Russia backs Iran quietly. China buys its oil in silence. And in the global South, the conflict is seen less as good versus evil and more as empire versus resistance. Because history matters. And in much of the world, Israel is not just a state, but a symbol of Western dominance. And Iran is not just a theocracy, but a challenge to that order. And so the conflict between them becomes a mirror of a divided world, of competing visions, modernity versus tradition, nation-state versus ideology, open markets versus religious resistance, and caught in between, diplomacy stumbles, because peace requires more than a deal. It requires belief that the other side will honor it, that tomorrow won't undo today, and in this conflict, tomorrow is always volatile. One drone, one strike, one election, can reset everything, and so diplomats return to their tables. They draft, they redraft, they shake hands, they pose for photographs, but outside the centrifuges spin and the missiles wait, because until the fear is gone, no paper will hold. It's been decades now, and still the war has no name, no battlefield, no treaties, no clear end, only silence, punctuated by alarms, drones overhead, and the quiet ticking of time. Israel and Iran, two ancient civilizations, modern nations, locked in a conflict neither fully chose and neither seems able to leave. For Israel, the conflict forged a reflex: strike first, defend at all costs, never again be caught off guard. It built a military that never sleeps, a network of spies, satellites, and strategies. An entire generation raised with one lesson: survival is never guaranteed. The sirens are part of daily life, the drills in school, the gas masks in storage, the tension in every border town. This vigilance shaped identity. Israel became not just a state, but a fortress, an island, a people who look forward, but always sideways. For Iran, the conflict became something different. It became pride, resistance, a way to stand tall in a world that often pushed it down. The sanctions, the threats, the isolation, they fed a narrative that Iran stood alone against a global conspiracy, that its enemies feared its truth, that martyrdom was victory and compromise betrayal. And so generations of Iranians grew up with murals of martyrs, with slogans of defiance, with lessons that dignity was worth any price. Two nations, two traumas, two truths, incompatible. But this war has done more than divide them. It has reshaped them. It has made diplomacy feel weak, peace feel naive. It has made normalcy a privilege. Because behind every headline, every drone strike, every speech are real people. A boy in Haifa who learns the range of Hezbollah's rockets before he learns to drive. A girl in Tehran who memorizes the names of sanctions before she knows what countries they came from. This is the cost no one counts, the erosion of imagination, the narrowing of what feels possible, the slow, steady dimming of futures. And yet, there is always a spark. In quiet corners, people talk, not just of revenge, but of relief, of what it would feel like to live without the weight, to walk without suspicion, to dream without calculation. There are Iranians who question the cost. There are Israelis who question the cycle they exist. Whispers under slogans, quiet minds in loud places, and perhaps, in time, those whispers grow. Perhaps this conflict, so long defined by shadow, can end not with a bang, but a breath, a moment when fear loosens its grip, when leaders remember they are mortal, when vengeance pauses long enough for a different story to begin, because all wars end eventually, even the ones that don't feel like wars, even the ones fought in silence, even the ones written in the hearts of nations. And when it ends, if it ends, it will not be with parades, not with flags, not with statues, but with silence, with a generation that wakes up and realizes they're not afraid, that they don't know the enemy, that they don't need to, and maybe then peace won't be a word. It'll be a normal day, a full shelf, an open sky, just life at last.